Hello, I'm Dr. Steve Brown, Executive Director of the John F. Tinker Foundation, and joining me is John Tinker, and we're very pleased to welcome you to Tinker Live. This is our first of our many broadcasts of Tinker Live. This is the premiere of it, and John, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Steve. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to this.
Good, good. One of the things that we're going to be talking about today is going to be the case of Tinker v. Des Moines, and you can see on the screen right now. I'm going to give a little overview of the case. I know many people know about this landmark U.S. Supreme Court case that was decided in February of 1969, and this was when the U.S. Supreme Court established a standard favorable to a broad interpretation of students' First Amendment rights, in this case of Tinker v. Des Moines. The case began in 1965 when 3 Iowa public school students wore black armbands to protest the war in Vietnam. After being suspended by their principal, the students sued. And when their case reached the U.S. Supreme Court 4 years later, the justices decided by a 7-2 majority that the First Amendment did apply to public school students. As you can see from the quote over my right shoulder, Justice Abe Fortas wrote in the majority opinion that it can hardly be argued that either students or teachers, and it's interesting that he included teachers, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It's interesting that he included teachers, do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. John, as I read that, let me just ask you something. What comes to mind as you look at that case and you think about the case in terms of just those words that students and teachers do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's right. Students and teachers, we're persons under the law, under the Constitution. And so we're endowed with our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. So yes, it applies to students and teachers. Teachers can be bound by other requirements of their contract that students are not bound by. But it doesn't permit students or teachers to disrupt the educational environment, but it does give us both teachers and students, gives us the right to let our opinions be known, basically. Mm-hmm. If we can express those opinions without disrupting the school, we have a right to let people know what we think.
Sure. And we'll talk in a few minutes about the Tinker Standard, which really came out of your case. And for many of you who are watching right now who know about the case, the Tinker Standard is something that is very important. And after the Tinker decision, there are some who believe that standard has kind of lost some of the glow, if you will. And John, I'll ask you in a few minutes to share that story when you were sitting at the U.S. Supreme Court, when you were sitting right next to Justice Alito a year or so ago. But before we talk about that, John, let me ask you this. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, if you were speaking to a group of 9th graders or 10th graders right now who knew absolutely nothing about the Tinker case, and you had 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes or so, to give them the facts of the case, how it started, some of the key points of the case itself, and what the court decision was, what kinds of things would you say in that very condensed amount of time?
Sure. Myself and some other students had been following the progress of the war in Vietnam, and we were very concerned about it. we decided that we really did not support the war and that we wanted more people to become aware of the war. And so to do that, we decided to wear black armbands on our shirt sleeves in order to let people know that we mourn the killing in Vietnam, and we supported the idea of having a truce in Vietnam. And so when the school authorities found out that we were going to wear these armbands, they decided that they weren't going to permit it. And so some of us decided to wear the armbands anyway. And we felt that we had a right to express our views. It was a silent symbol of our opinion. We weren't disrupting the class. We were just letting people know what we thought, and we were hoping that other people would start paying more attention to the war.
Mm-hmm.
So we got suspended from school. We decided to sue the school because of our First Amendment rights. And so we took it to the federal district court in Des Moines. There we lost. We appealed to the appellate court in St. Louis. They split, so it upheld our earlier loss. And then we appealed to the US Supreme Court. They agreed to hear our case, and they found in our favor 7-2. And so that became over 50 years ago is when that happened, and it became a precedent for First Amendment rights in the schools, that students are persons within the meaning of the Constitution, and therefore they have their First Amendment rights.
Sure. And you know, I mentioned a few minutes ago the Tinker Standard, and basically the Tinker Standard essentially says that the students have the right to protest, they have the right of freedom of expression, as long as it does not create a material and substantial disruption. And John, when you think about those words, a material and substantial disruption, and if you think about that in terms of 2020 and 2019, when students have protested many things over the last year or two, whether it be, you know, the shootings in our schools or Black Lives Matter, where high school students have marched and everything. How do you think the Tinker Standard has stood up to time since 1969?
My personal view is that it has stood up fairly well, that the court has protected students' abilities to express their opinions in a non-disruptive way. There have been several cases that have diminished students' rights to say anything they want. In the Frazier case, Matthew Frazier basically told a dirty joke to the student body, and the court agreed with the school administration finally that they could limit that sort of behavior because they said it was disruptive to the educational process. The Frederick v. Morse case, Joe Frederick carried a sign, bong hits for Jesus, and the court decided that the school had the ability to censor, to not permit messages that seemed to encourage the use of illegal drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So,
John, by the way, in the Morse v. Frederick case a few years ago, you and myself and my former department chair at Northeastern Illinois University had a chance to talk about that case with Kenneth Starr, Judge Starr, who represented the school district. He represented Deborah Morse, mm-hmm. and of course Judge Starr was also involved earlier with issues related to then President Bill Clinton.
Hmm.
But if you recall, Judge Starr basically also said that he certainly has always thought that the Tinker decision was a sound decision, didn't he?
Yes, he did, and he stressed that the Frederick v. Morse uh, case was a very narrow cutout
Hmm.
to the Tinker case. And that's really how I see it, that there have been these cutouts because the school environment and the educational environment does require some limits to freedom of speech, that you can't behave in a classroom like you could behave on a street corner if you wanted to.
Sure.
Um, so in my view, it's reasonable. Generally, the Hazelwood case, where the student was censored from publishing a newspaper article, I think is a much more serious violation of the principle that was involved in the Tinker standard.
Hmm.
And I don't think the school in that case showed any evidence that that newspaper article would have been disruptive. And it was a serious article about a serious issue.
Sure.
And
And but by the way, in the Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer case, and by the way, at some point in the near future, we'll do a Tinker Live with yourself and myself and maybe someone else, along with Kathy Kohlmeyer Fry, who was certainly involved in that. But as you know, in that particular case, first of all, the principal uh, um, or previously at that school, they ran those same newspaper articles dealing with divorce, uh, and and, uh, and the school had run those same articles a few years before, and apparently the principal at the time, during the Hazelwood case, when that article was published in the Spectrum, and the Hazelwood School District is just outside of in the greater St. Louis, Missouri area, apparently hadn't even read the articles, and then he just took out that whole section of the newspaper. But you know, when you look at all of these issues, the Hazelwood case, Bethel v. Frazier, Morse v. Frederick, and other cases, whether students wearing a Confederate flag on a sweatshirt or having it on their vehicle, or students who are marching, let's say Black Lives Matter. Um, um, how do we determine, in your estimation, as John Tinker, as the lead plaintiff, as the first name, in the court case of Tinker v. Des Moines, okay? Um, how do we sort all that out about what is disruptive or not, and whose eyes are we looking at to determine what is disruptive and what causes a material and substantial disruption? I always have trouble. I always have trouble, and you and I have talked like this for well over 20 years now in my school law classes, and we've done presentations live before a studio audience. And I always wonder, what exactly does that mean? A material and substantial disruption? Is it the people who are hearing it and how they actually are interpreting it?
well, I think that Abe Fortas, when he used that language in the whole decision, really, as he wrote it, um, he's being conscious of the role of free expression, especially the expression of ideas, and most especially the expression of political ideas.
Hmm.
Uh, those are that expression is very, very important to our form of government. And so the ability of people to communicate about ideas really must be preserved. Um, at the same time, our society believes in compulsory education for young people. And so there's going to be a tension between those two goals. And I think that there's a rule, the concept of a rule as setting a boundary, and the idea that people will, wherever there's a boundary, people are going to test the boundary,
Hmm.
and people are going to see where that limit is and how far can I push it. But really, the that's not the way that we make our society work. We really need to use our minds and not be trying to see where the boundary is, not trying to test the limit, because we really need to stay in a civil mode. That's my opinion. Our society and our ability to interact with each other as a society requires that we be civil with each other. And it's not civil to shake your fist at somebody and threaten them.
Sure.
And even though you may threaten them with language, and so you say, well, that's speech and free speech, but still, that free speech is offensive in a number of ways, and it's known to be offensive, and it has been for forever. People know that fighting words are different from the language that we use when we discuss ideas. And so, especially in the educational environment where um, you have a captive audience, they're required to be in that school. Um, the idea that you would limit expressive behavior to civil behavior at the same time does not seem unreasonable to me. I think that's probably the only way we can do it. And so the going into a school with a T-shirt or something that is patently offensive to some other group of people or other person even in the school, that's not the communication of an idea. That's that's saying I want to fight. I want to have a conflict.
Let me ask you this. Um, in the last year or so, with regards to the student marches, in the last year or so, with regards to Black Lives Matter and other causes, how do you see those kinds of marches related to the anti-war marches of the 1960s?
Well, there have been a number of these marches and demonstrations, and they've been different. They haven't all been the same. Um, of course, the marches against the war were not all the same either. Um, the I I can't help but think that your peaceful protest is the only kind of protest that society can really permit to to be within the rules of society. If you do a violent protest or if you're destroying property, society cannot say, well, that's okay. It's and the Martin Luther King Jr. With the civil rights movement, he understood that, and so he believed that the nonviolent protest was the more effective protest, and I agree with that. And I understand that Black people and brown people have been very mistreated for a long, long time. There's no question about that. But still, the resolution of that, in my view, is not um, rioting and the destruction of property. Now, it's also true at the same time I say that, it's true that it's been shown by academics that rioting and the destruction of property can be effective in terms of achieving social change, but it can't be sanctioned by society. It will always be a breaking of the norms of society to be violent or destructive of property. But I am very supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. We had a protest in a small town here in central Missouri, a rural town. We had a protest, about 100 people attended. The chief of police in that town gave a very supportive speech. Um, he assured everyone that he was not going to permit racial discrimination in his police department. And it was very believable. And uh, it was a wonderful event. I've heard of other events that were not so wonderful. And a lot of times the younger people really do not understand that social change is a matter of communicating an idea to a whole society. At some level, the whole society, or the society as a whole, I should say, needs to come to agree with you. And with regard to civil rights, generally speaking, that has happened. Both for racial issues and for gender issues are largely resolved in the public mind. That doesn't mean everybody um, agrees, but the society as a whole does. Our society today uh, condemns racism as a whole. Not everybody condemns it, and we just saw our president decline more or less
Hmm.
to condemn it. But our society as a whole, I believe, does condemn racism. Um, anyway, to sum up, I'm a believer in nonviolent activism, and I strongly feel that violence really enables your opponent to take the upper hand, and so it's really a counterproductive tactic, in my opinion.
Hmm. Before I ask you a few wrap-up questions, um, and by the way, this is our premiere broadcast, or podcast, or video cast, whatever you want to call it, of Tinker Live. And we will be doing these on an ongoing basis, and we'll be posting these on the John F. Tinker Foundation website. But um, when you look back to December, actually January of 1966, when you went back to school after you were suspended, when you, Mary Beth, your sister, the late Christopher Eckhart, who also wore the black armband. Actually, Chris went into the office and said, "I'm wearing the black armband," and and uh, and got suspended anyway. And then of course Mary Beth wore the black armband, went to the office, and she went into the office. She was told to take it off, and she did. And then she still got suspended, right?
Mhm.
But anyway, after you wore the black armband at your school in Des Moines, and you went back to school in January of 1966, what kind of reaction did you get from students? And did any students, by the way, I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway, because I want our audience, I want our listeners to get a sense. But how do students treat you, and did any students come to your defense?
Yeah, when I went back to school, I wore all black then from January through June for the whole rest of the year.
And by the way, that the first time you told me that, and by the way, I love that we can talk about it this way, because you and I have been doing this for, I mean, it's over 20 years now. But when you
Yes,
first mentioned that in one of my school law classes, I was blown away. Here you are, you're, you're 15, 16 years old, and you decided, okay, I can't wear that black armband on my arm, but I'm going to do something that's just going to be, in many ways, just as effective and just as in the face of everyone. I'm going to wear all black. And by the way, when you made that decision to do that, did you talk about that with your parents at the time?
no, I don't remember talking to my parents about it. It was, I may have just informed them that that's what I was going to do. I was very confident that I had done nothing wrong by wearing the black armband. I hadn't disrupted anything. It was really my opinion against the war that they were upset with,
Sure.
not my behavior. And so, I mean, I was a teenager and strategizing how to evade adult rules, and the wearing of all black clothing was sort of my, my next
Sure. So,
my next
so,
approach.
so
I mean, you ask how people treated me,
yeah,
and
yeah,
people did not mistreat me. I had a few that were just nasty, but I had friends and a lot of people who I didn't know. They didn't mistreat me. Everybody in the school basically knew what the black clothing meant,
sure.
but I had a mixed reaction, but a lot of good reaction. I had one of the social studies teachers who um, every year, that was 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, he always asked me to speak to his classes, just like I've spoken to your classes, Steve.
Hmm.
I was a guest speaker in the high school social studies classes, talking about the war in Vietnam. I had another high school history teacher who was very supportive of me. Um, I had a couple of teachers, my physics teacher and an English teacher, who were aggressive toward me, mean toward me.
Hmm.
Uh, my physics teacher, I had done very well in his class, and
I mean, you were a merit scholar finalist, right?
I was an honorable mention in the
Okay.
Merit Scholar.
Okay.
I'm not bragging that I was an academic, but I did well in physics. So
Okay.
I had produced the first perfect physics test for this
Mhm.
teacher in
Wow.
10 years.
Wow.
And yet, when it came time for my final grade, he graded me down for having a bad attitude. And it was definitely my attitude about the war that he was talking about. So I had a history teacher the same year, and he said, John, you deserved a B in history, but I'm going to give you an A in history because I know other teachers
Right.
are
Right.
great.
And then the one student who came to your defense, I think in the cafeteria, who was on the football team, right?
Yeah, this happened before the court case,
Right.
while I was actually wearing the armband. I was at the lunch table and talking with my friends, um, and some students came up to pester me. A couple of kids, and they were calling me a commie and a coward and things like that. And one of the football players came over and he said to those two boys, he said, "Look, you have your opinion about the war in Vietnam. John has his opinion about the war. John has a right to his opinion, so leave him alone." And this was a football player, so this is like a big guy, and it was really fun to be defended by a football player.
Sure. John, the final question I have for you is, um, what do you know today that you did not know when you were a teenager and would like to share with not just young people who might be taking action today to protest against any injustices, but just anyone else who's watching or listening to this who knows about everything that's been going on with whether it's Black Lives Matter or any of the injustices and the marches that we've seen over the last year or so, in the last minute that we have.
Well, I'd say one thing that I've learned is that people held me up as a courageous young person. And people have expressed admiration for my courage. And I honestly did not think of myself as a courageous person at the time. I just felt like I was doing what I should be doing. But I've learned that a lot of people in society are very afraid to express their opinion. And we have a way of controlling our own behavior so that we don't make waves. And I've seen a lot of that. I've heard a lot of stories of it. And I've heard a lot of stories by people who weren't afraid, and who went ahead and did what they thought they should do. And then other people, many people have told me they also wore armbands during that time, and they would tell me what happened to them, or their parents wouldn't permit it. And there was a lot of fear about expressing an opinion against the war. Now, later, a lot of people came to see that war as wrong. A majority of people came to see the war as a mistake. And we were way out front with that opinion. And so kids often can see things coming that adults maybe are hesitant, they're timid. Adults themselves are afraid of losing their position, offending their friends, and so on. And so kids can be braver, really, sometimes than adults. And so it leaves me wanting to encourage young people to speak their minds. And I also want to encourage adults to listen to young people, because very often young people are telling us things that if we would just calm down and think about it, we would figure out for ourselves.
Well, John, I want to thank you uh, for taking the time. This is the inaugural broadcast, if you will, podcast. I always say broadcast because my background's in TV and radio, as you know, before I went into education. But our first video cast, or whatever you want to call it, of Tinker Live. And of course, this is being sponsored through the John F. Tinker Foundation. It will be posted on the John F. Tinker Foundation website. We'll have some other distribution sites as well. John, I want to thank you. We'll be doing more of these. And this has been not only a lot of fun, but every time you and I talk, I always learn more and more about the case. And for me, it never gets, it never gets dull or tiring, because I enjoy talking to you, and I know how passionate you are. So I want to thank you so much. I want to thank your wife, Patricia, for all of her work in helping to set this up as well. John, Tinker Live continues to live. So I'm using the same word pronounced both ways.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve. I want to thank you very much for really helping to put the foundation together, for putting this series together. I'm really looking forward to it. It's really fun. I love to offer my opinion, and I'm really looking forward to that opportunity. So, Steve, you're a perfect person to be the executive director of the foundation. I'm really glad that you accepted that position. And thank you so much for organizing this series of podcasts.
Okay, very good. Anyway, I'm Steve Brown, and John Tinker, of course, is with me now. And we look forward to our future broadcasts. So be sure to check the John F. Tinker Foundation for more information about that. And for everyone, thank you so much for viewing.
And thank you.